Thank you, Midori. I One of the chief questions, as the rainbow wheel of death goes, one of the chief questions that we've been thinking about in relationship to the causes and solutions to the homelessness problem is where to place art and social movements in the same kind of context as social science. And so in some ways, I've had to think about this as social science being at the intersection of art, engagement, and social movements. And so one of the ways that we've tried to work with some of our colleagues is to use the concept of mapping. And one of our artists slash social movement organizers, Manon, has already done work on the worst evictors in New York City. And so as you'll see in this map, these follow very strong segregation patterns that also exist in New York City. And there's a number of maps that you can look at that provide kind of the real estate point of view. There's also flood maps that will show you different segregated neighborhoods. And you can also look at educational districting as well. New York Times has a website that you can look at the segregation there as well. But Manon worked with organizers to map precisely where evictions were taking place. And so you can see the larger the dots, that's the larger number of evictions. And what we've been able to kind of put together with social science data from both HUD data from the federal government and then from New York City Council itself is that, probably unsurprising to anybody who's studied gentrification, one of the chief systemic drivers of homelessness is racism, being that people are being forced out of particular neighborhoods and outpriced due to rising costs and then the denial of loans and mortgages. So in social science, I wanted to take kind of a longer historical perspective, and so this kind of idea of gentrification can be traced back to the original settlers of New York State and the displacement of a variety of Native American communities, including the Lenape. Probably most surprising to people who haven't studied the law in particular, or who are still kind of holding on to ideas about constitutional rights, is that James Madison very famously wrote that the first object of the entire structure of the Constitution and legal order was to protect the different and unequal faculties for acquiring property. So there was never any intent in the United States to have equality, particularly when it came to property. It was about maintaining control over property for certain people. My own ancestors came to this country from England in the 1600s and actually moved to this little area called West Farms, which is on the Bronx River, and that continues the privilege that I've held today. And so sometimes students and others see this as an issue of the past, but we can actually trace literally through maps how this privilege has been passed down from generation to the next. And then some kind of common concepts you might find in social science textbooks that are not often examined that lead to this kind of myth of the American dream or the idea of equality of property ownership are based in the right of discovery, legal sovereignty, access to courts, and the right to violent dispossession, when in reality, these four concepts actually work together for racial capitalism. So historically, maps have been used as tools of domination, going back to colonial exploration all the way up to how we think about zoning and using what we call development, right, in economic terms today. And so this is not a normal thing for people to think about as being a tool for resistance. But Manon and Rob Robinson and others have thought about using this same tool that colonizers have used and the state uses today to displace people to be a double-edged sword, to fight back against those same displacements. And Manon's done work in San Francisco, in Los Angeles, Paris, and then also now in New York City. And so this is an interesting tool that they've been able to use across social groups. So there's people involved in housing rights, there's people involved in the climate change fight, and so each of these kind of actors has been able to come together and learn how to use this tool to resist gentrification. And then in my classroom, and I've been able to use a variety of maps and some of the resources that come along with them to get further into detail about how the law interacts with the displacement of particular groups of people over time. And so this all started with one student who began with a theory called actor network theory, and she mapped her neighborhood and identified the structural inequalities that led to homelessness in her neighborhood, I believe in Bensonhurst. After that, 5 students conducted legal case research, looking up specific cases, largely following the patterns that Rob Robinson and others had followed, and then also looking at United Nations decisions and efforts to try to curb homelessness globally. That built up to 33 students, then traced the crime of being homeless from today's kind of laws all the way back to Reconstruction time period after the Civil War, and how that led into the Jim Crow laws, and being particularly targeted towards recently freed and enslaved peoples. And now we have over 100 plus students who are examining what's called legal consciousness and rights mobilization, and thinking about how mapping and other artistic renditions of social science data can be used as a
recording
tool
in progress.
Social change. Finally, I began to try to do curricular integration of this research, which is based on my own work, and then to integrate that with student work, some of the community groups that I've been speaking to, and then using a tool called story maps to try to construct a new visual and a new narrative. And I'm trying to be clever here in titling it Leaving Dystopia and Finding Utopia. And one of the things that Midori and I have worked on is a grant to try to get the resources necessary for Kingsborough to use this tool in multiple classrooms. And that is the end of that story.